Welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, the podcast for the leaders and entrepreneurs of today.
Way to go, guys. Way to go. Keep it going. Good job, guys. All right, Paul, I see you. All right, Charlie. Finish, Sean. Go.
Great job, guys.
Hey there, it's Coach Curl here, and welcome to episode 324 of the Today's Leader podcast, the podcast for the leaders and the entrepreneurs of today. Now, this week I'm sharing a leadership development episode, and that's largely due to the fact that the editing processes for a global experts was just not capable of getting done this week. And one of the main reasons behind that was the fact that I'm actually in Uluru and running and preparing to run the Australian Outback Marathon. So when things return to normal and I get back into Brisbane, our very next episode on a Thursday will, of course, be a global expert interview. So please bear with me as we walk through a development episode, which is all about what we see as some of the problems that are faced within organizations. So we call it leadership modeling for a reason, because often we see problems associated with leadership within organizations that has been a culmination of history, that's been a culmination of tradition. So we see the role modeling of some really poor leadership behaviors continue right throughout. So this episode is called The Problem with Leadership, and they just happen to fall into what I would call a 5 Ps framework. So areas of problems that resoundingly start with P. So now the reason why I bring this up is to help leaders navigate through these situations if they are occurring in your workforce or are part of the environment in which you lead and manage. Now, one thing that I do want to make clear is if you do identify this, I want you to understand that you are not alone, because I've coached hundreds of leaders since I've branched out and built my own leadership coaching practice. And some of the problems that we're going to discuss today are regular problems that occur. So if you do consider any of these, if you do identify with any of these situations that we're going to talk about, please understand you are not alone. So the first one we're going to talk about is positional posturing. So positional posturing. And this is when a leader postures purely on their status or position or their title. And what we see within this on a regular basis is that what sits inside that particular leader is usually an insecure leader. So things like titles, car parks, best offices are the visual aspects of ego and positional posturing. Now, the problem with positional leadership, it is actually the hardest level of leadership, because what we see is that people will only follow you because they have to. It's not because they want to or they respect you, it's because they have to. And that's driven from title. And usually the fixation on position and title are driven from an internal lack of belief in one's own ability, but the creation of self and ego. So it's a really challenging environment to be in as a leader if you identify purely as a leader because of your title, position, and status. These personal attributes are never good for developing better leadership, because a better leader is all about how do I continue to develop the team, how do I continue to grow my deliverables in this organization. Whereas if you're driven from ego and status and position, it's largely becomes a very selfish aspect of leadership. So when dealing with a positional leader, be mindful of those characteristics. Be mindful of what they're being driven on, and be mindful not to threaten them, because a positional leader who has their status and title threatened will respond usually in a very negative sense. Now, if you happen to be to lead a leader like this, your responsibility is to ensure that they are developed to remove that sense of status and ego that is the driving force behind them. Mentor and role model what leadership looks like. Now, if you report to a positional leader or a positional posturing leader, you also have a role to play. Deliver what's needed to keep their status and their ego threats at base. Lead with authenticity, and you become the role model for what leadership should be. So number 2 is political positioning. So have you ever had a leader that's more occupied with playing the political game than leading their team? That's what we call political positioning, where the leader is more interested in playing politics to gain favour rather than focusing on the roles and outcomes from their own role. Now, political leaders are constantly manoeuvring, constantly checking with the ebbs and flow of the power struggle, the influences, the balances, the imbalances. They are constantly checking in with that, and they're constantly shifting and manoeuvring their position. They willingly will throw others under the bus. You know that. They'll take credit where it's not due, and are constantly wanting to look good for the powers that be. And they'll talk about the powers that be. And, usually it is a very good indicator of who is a political leader by the use of that term. Now, people who have been bitten by the political leader rarely leave themselves open to have it done again. And this is the concept of mistrust. It rears its ugly head, inhibits the performance of the team and the business. Now, political leaders experience high churn because people are just another resource for them to get the outcomes that they want. And these outcomes are usually based on their own selfish agenda. Now, working under a political leader is frustrating. But one thing I've learned that you can gain an understanding of the politics within the organisation by tuning into what it is that they're working through. Every company has a degree of political power, whether it's power blocks, influences, they've all got a degree of politics. Career ambitious people need to understand that, but not necessarily embrace it. Political positioning is one of the worst things in corporate leadership. Don't get sucked into the game, but be aware and tread with caution. Have you ever had a leader or a manager, one above, override the decisions of your direct report? If you have, that's what we call the pecking order power plays. And usually what they do by overriding your direct leader is that they're giving you conflicting instructions. Now, it is truly a pain to be in that position, and it's challenging if you're caught in the middle. Many who get caught up in this conundrum, it's easy to simply choose the tasks of the higher ranking leader, and that's understandable. But ultimately, you've got to understand why is this happening? Why is this particular thing happening where the leader or the manager one above is bypassing your direct manager and providing tasks and priorities to yourself? What is the reason? Now, it could be a question of competence of your direct manager. It could be mistrust. It could be non-alignment to company objectives. So the leader one above is then removing them from the decision-making rather than working with them to develop them to actually bring them in line. So it could be a matter of competence, mistrust, or non-alignment. It could be that the manager one above is much more comfortable playing in the space where you're at. Maybe they could have some issues within their own question around their own capability. And so they're more comfortable playing in their comfort zone, which is directing people at your level, maybe. It could be a personality clash. It could be a clear dislike for each other, and it could be a simmering conflict. So those things are really important to understand. Why is it happening? Because ultimately that's how you will be making the right choices for you in how you prioritize and manage through that workload. It ultimately provides your reasoning. Now, the reality is that you should not be placed in that position. Simple. And for every leader that's listening to this, that approach is simply should not happen. If you're unhappy with the direction of a leader that reports to you, who are then directing other leaders, your role is to provide performance management structure in and around that leader. It's not about bypassing them and removing them and ignoring their position. It's a simple problem that continues to evolve and continues to happen in workplaces right around the world, but it's a problem that should not happen. So be very, very mindful of that, especially if you are the one that's caught in the middle. Be aware of the reasons why it's happening and make your choices accordingly. Now, piss poor leadership is number 4, and there was no other way that I could describe this. This is pretty self-explanatory. And one of the things that I've encountered just recently, I've started to use TikTok to understand how I can use TikTok in my business and how to grow and develop a leadership brand on TikTok. But you really quickly discover the concepts of piss poor leadership on this particular app. Now, the stories from people and how their leaders have reacted poorly to situations, how they react poorly to conflict, the old my way or the highway scenario is a constant on this app. The poor leadership displayed, poor behaviors, poor decisions, you've got vindictiveness, all of it. We have a pandemic of piss poor leadership. And this is one of the real challenges that we face. Now, managers in leadership positions who shouldn't be, for whatever reason, are really common and visual, once again, on this particular app. Companies and leaders have a huge responsibility to deliver better outcomes for businesses, outcomes for customers and clients, and, of course, outcomes for your team. Now, this is the very root of what your customers and your clients see. They're seeing disgruntled staff affected by piss poor leadership. Sometimes these leadership behaviours are driven from the top, so be very, very aware of that. But the acceptance of these behaviours are always driven from the top. If you're allowing your frontline, your first time, your middle managers to treat their team poorly and you know it's happening, and you're not investing in resources that can improve their leadership, you are just as much as fault as what a piss poor leader is on the front line. Having effective performance management processes in place is important. Having principles that outline leadership in your organization is also important. And providing development, the right sort of development, is critical in these sorts of areas. You've got to make your leadership principles very visual and celebrate the modeling of the leadership call. So where does piss poor leadership get seen? It gets seen in poor scheduling or poor rostering. It gets seen where some people are favourites within a team and get away with it while others are not. You see it in bullying. You see it in harassment. All of these are evidence of piss poor leadership, and usually driven from a lack of role models, a lack of development, and a lack of mentoring. Now, number 5 is poisoned culture. So we've gone through the 5 areas here of the 5 Ps of the problems with leadership. The last one is poisoned culture. Now, anytime you feel a toxic culture, it comes from the chair. Everything that happens in your business comes from the chair. As a leader, we accept that. We accept that as a responsibility, and it's a right in your business that the culture is driven from the person that's ultimately in the chair. Now, I'm reminded of a previous episode that I did with Breton Putter, and his 6 ways to identify and ultimately lift company culture are really relevant here if you understand and are aware that your culture is not where it should be. Now, the 6 steps that Breton outlined was, number 1, what you reward and recognize. Number 2, what you measure and pay attention to. Number 3, how you train, mentor, and develop your people. Number 4, how you invest and allocate resources. Number 5, how you behave in difficult situations. And number 6, how you hire, fire, and promote. Now, all of those things have a massive impact, a huge impact on the culture that you want within your organization. So when you can honestly answer the questions and reflect on them honestly, the insights that you gain is immense. And that's your starting point for challenging and fixing the toxic culture that you may be aware of. So I'll just go through the 5 P's again. Number 1, positional posturing. Number 2, political positioning. Number 3, pecking order power plays. Number 4, piss poor leadership. And number 5 is a poisoned culture. Now, the big thing for yourself as a leader is if you becoming aware of these problems if they're in your environment. And working effectively in those environments, it can often be challenging. But awareness is the actual foundation to get it better. So I would challenge you all. Someone has to be the better leader. Someone has to role model leadership. And I would suggest, why can't it be you? We are facing a contagion of poor leadership. It's a problem that magnifies and grows within companies, and poor cultures passing the poor leadership down through the levels. And just as good leadership multiplies through influence and respect, poor leaders multiply as well. And it's all dependent and contingent on the culture that you breed within your leadership principles and practices. Self-leadership for any leader out there is critical in these environments. Be the leader that can be trusted. Be the leader that develops others. Be the leader that delivers value over and above for the organization. And maybe you can become the role model for what leadership should look like in your organization. Just because you're surrounded by problem leadership doesn't mean you become part of the problem. Thanks for tuning in to episode 324 of the Today's Leader podcast. Who would have thought we would have made it this far? But thank you so much for tuning in. Don't forget the golden rule. You know what it is. Just don't be an arsehole. And next week we return with an expert, another global expert interview on the Today's Leader podcast. I'll see you then.